Welcome to Psychology. In this lecture, I'd like to talk a little bit about what psychology is, the different areas of psychology, some of the history of the field of psychology, and some recent trends within psychology. Psychology began as its own independent discipline in 1879, so it's only been around as a unique field for somewhat over 100 years. In comparison to areas like philosophy, physiology, and biology, psychology is still a very, very young science. Prior to that time, people who were interested in psychological questions would often be housed under philosophy or physiology. Philosophers like to ask questions such as, what does it mean to be human? What is love? Those kinds of things. And of course, psychologists would like to answer those questions as well. Physiologists would like to understand basic bodily processes like how the brain functions. But from a psychological standpoint, we can talk about how the brain functions in relationship to processes like memory, language, cognition, perception, and then of course various psychological disorders like depression and schizophrenia. So psychology really brought together some of the questions that people have, but there wasn't a unique discipline focused on studying the relationship between the brain and behavior. So psychology started in 1879, but ever since then it's still had a bit of what we call an identity crisis. If you haven't already yet, go ahead and open up the PowerPoint presentation entitled, What is Psychology? You can feel free just to click down through the slides as I go through the lecture, or you can actually start the slideshow. I'll give you a prompt when I want you to advance to the next slide. The first slide is actually titled, What is Psychology? And there is a nice quote here that summarizes the identity crisis that psychology still has today. And that is, what shall we accept as the subject matter of psychology if we are to treat psychology as a science? Psychology, first and foremost, is recognized as a science. We use the scientific method to answer questions, much like we would in other fields like biology or chemistry. We make a hypothesis, we test a hypothesis, and then we determine whether or not our hypothesis was true. The only difference is, instead of studying things like gravity or moles of molecules or blood flow in the body, we study things like intelligence and courage and love and memory, which can be a lot harder to define. But we still believe that psychology is a science. Sometimes it's just a little bit harder for us to get one standard definition of what it is that we're studying. We recognize by definition that psychology is the study of behavior and mental processes. Let me say that again. Psychology is the study of behavior and mental processes. Now that is a pretty broad definition, but that makes sure that anything that anyone would study under the area of psychology is included. So we keep it that broad intentionally because as the field of psychology expands, we want to make sure there is room for everyone. If you take a look at the next slide, I want to differentiate for you the difference between basic and applied psychology. These are the two major areas within psychology. Most people in the field would identify themselves primarily as being one or the other, and sometimes you can have both. In basic psychology, the goal is to understand psychological processes. Basic psychology is research-oriented, so what we find out may not have any immediate applications. The goal is simply to understand psychological processes. So for instance, I might do an experiment to try to understand how you remember. Or I might do another experiment that would manipulate your level of prejudice in a given situation. I don't have any immediate application for that. I may have something in mind later on, but in basic research, I'm simply trying to understand what is. The other side of psychology is what we call applied psychology. And people who are on this side of applied psychology would use the information gathered by basic psychologists in some sort of application or practice. So for instance, if I understand a little bit more about memory processes from the research from the basic psychologist, I might incorporate that when I'm trying to do some rehabilitation on a patient who recently had a stroke, or a child who is having problems in school and needs better memory skills. So basic psychologists and applied psychologists work hand in hand. You really can't have one without the other. The opposite would be true. If an applied psychologist sees that there is a problem, for example, with how children are learning math, he or she might ask a basic psychologist to do some research on that. So the basic psychologist is going to find the what part, and the applied psychologist is going to apply the how. Now that we understand what's going on, how can we use this information? I do have some examples of cases in which basic and applied psychology go hand in hand. The website on this slide is a website to a sensation-seeking scale. Sensation-seeking is a phenomenon in which people are, by nature, thrill seekers. You may know people like this. They love to skydive. They love to gamble. They love to drive fast. They love to ride roller coasters. They jump out of airplanes. They actually enjoy those thrill-seeking experiences. Sometimes sensation seekers can engage in somewhat risky behaviors, but it's all about the thrill. So a basic psychologist can either observe people during sensation-seeking practices or simply give them a survey to find out more about their beliefs and perceptions regarding sensation-seeking. The applied psychologist can then use that information in therapy. There is a connection between sensation-seeking and depression. That is, people who are sensation seekers are more likely to be depressed, and they use these sensation-seeking adventures, these thrilling adventures, to almost alleviate or reduce the symptoms of their depression. In other words, if you kind of get a rush from doing something exciting, then you might not feel as depressed. So a therapist might use the information gained by the basic psychologist to aid in therapy of someone who is depressed, once the therapist identifies that this person does engage in sensation-seeking behaviors. The second website that I have is a study on being able to read facial expressions. Common facial expressions like happiness, anger, sadness, fear, disgust, and contempt. So a basic psychologist would be interested in determining how well you can pick out somebody's facial expression. If I show you a picture, could you accurately identify what emotion that person is feeling? So the basic psychologist is going to find whether or not you're good at it. In application, though, someone who is found to be very good at identifying emotions through facial expressions would probably do well in a field like therapy or even in criminal profiling. Because in therapy, that means you are more likely to have empathy toward the client. You can pick up on the emotions that he or she is feeling. And in profiling, you might better be able to pick out personality characteristics of this person if you are better able to read his or her facial expressions as an expression of his or her emotions. So again, this is how basic and applied psychology go hand in hand, and most people would readily identify themselves as really being one or the other in the field. If you take a look at the next slide, I want to go through some of the areas of basic psychology. Now there are a lot on this slide, and I certainly don't want you to know all of them, but I do want to highlight the ones that are important, the different areas of basic psychology that I would like for you to know. The first one is the one mentioned at the top, developmental psychology. And if you take a look at the pie chart at the top of the slide, you'll see that developmental psychology is a pretty big chunk of basic psychology. As you can imagine, people who are developmental psychologists study development. But they don't just study development, they study the development of different processes. So a developmental psychologist might study cognitive development in children, moral development. We can study personality development, language development. It's limitless. So you can almost put a developmental lens on almost anything that could potentially be studied. One common misperception is that people who are developmental psychologists would only study infants, children, and maybe adolescents, and that's not true. Development happens throughout our entire lifespan. We are always, quote, developing, in that we are always changing. Our mental abilities change. Our intelligence, the types of intelligence that we are really good at, changes. So you can be a, quote, developmental psychologist and only study aging people, because aging people are developing. Their cognitive skills might be declining, or certain types of intelligence might be declining, but it is still a developmental perspective, how our mental abilities change over time. So don't think that developmental psychology is simply limited to infancy, childhood, and adolescence. We study psychological changes throughout the entire lifespan. The next area of basic psychology that I'd like for you to know is social psychology. And obviously, people who are social psychologists would study interpersonal behavior. He or she might study phenomena such as discrimination, prejudice, stereotyping. He or she might study how we attribute causes for other people's behavior, how we respond to other people, maybe how we make impressions of other people, maybe how we conform to authority figures, or in what situations are we going to be obedient to authority figures, and interesting phenomena such as group behavior. It is well known that people tend to behave differently in groups than they might behave as just individuals. So a social psychologist could potentially study any of these things. Any area of mental abilities or processes that would have to deal with the social realm, with interpersonal behavior, interacting with other people. I'd like to skip down next to physiological psychology. This is also known as biological psychology. People in this area of basic psychology are the most closely linked into the relationship between the brain and behavior. So for instance, depression is caused by lower than normal levels of serotonin in the brain, or depression might be caused by lower than normal levels of norepinephrine in the brain. Serotonin and norepinephrine are known as neurotransmitters. They are chemical compounds in the brain that allows neurons to talk to each other. If there is a problem with memory, a biological or physiological psychologist might look at certain areas of the brain that are known to help with memory function. So anytime you see the word physiological or biological, that psychologist is trying to make a direct link between psychological processes and brain function. And most often, what happens to psychological processes when something is wrong, something is damaged, or something is abnormal in the brain. The next area of basic psychology that I'd like you to know is cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychologists focus on those higher level mental processes that we usually only ascribe to human beings. Decision making, judgment, strategy, planning, those kinds of things, and the problems that might go along with those higher order processes. For instance, our tendency to make mountains out of molehills, our tendency to ignore the positives of situations and only focus on the negatives of a situation. These are all cognitive processes that people engage in. Sometimes they're healthy, sometimes they're not, from a mental perspective. But this is what a cognitive psychologist might be interested in. He or she may also study higher mental functions such as memory and language. Those tend to fall under the umbrella of cognitive psychology. And of course, disorders that go along with memory and language. For instance, dyslexia. That would be one example of a language-based disorder. The last area that's mentioned here is personality, but I don't want you to focus on that as a separate area of basic psychology. So really the four that I'd like for you to know are developmental, social, physiological, and cognitive. As I mentioned, developmental is a large percentage of basic psychology. Social, almost as big, got a little bit over 20%. Physiological, almost 10%. And cognitive, about 7 to 8%. So those four areas make up a large percentage of people who engage in basic psychology. On the other side, if you take a look at the next slide, is applied psychology. And this might be the type of psychology that you're more familiar with, because this is the type of psychology that you tend to see highlighted more often in the media. Most basic psychologists are going to be working at a college or a university or a lab setting somewhere. Applied psychologists tend to be out there. They are on TV, or they're engaging in therapy. They have a private practice somewhere, or they're working in a school or a business or for the government. So it's quite common that applied psychologists are more visible. They're the more visible side of psychology, so as a result, people tend to be a little bit more familiar with these areas. The first one, and probably the biggest area of psychology, is clinical. If you take a look at the pie chart, it accounts for a large percentage of applied psychology, and as I just said, a large percentage of psychology in general. Clinical psychologists focus on evaluating people for psychological disorders, diagnosing them, and treating them. So these psychologists focus primarily on a population of people with what we call clinical disorders. Disorders that require treatment. They can be severe, such as substance abuse or schizophrenia, or sometimes not quite as severe, as in mild anxiety or mild depression. But clinical psychologists, first and foremost, are going to work in a setting to treat these populations specifically. You are most likely to find a clinical psychologist in a clinical setting, such as a hospital or institution, maybe a treatment or rehabilitation center. But this is where they are going to work first and foremost. Now, a clinical psychologist can also have a private practice somewhere to see clients on an as-needed basis in his or her office. But because they deal with disordered populations, primarily you are going to see them in some sort of clinical setting. So they're going to focus on individual therapy, group therapy, and other types of therapy for these clients. Clinical psychology is different from the next area, which is counseling psychology. Counseling psychologists treat people who have more everyday, run-of-the-mill issues. That is, people who don't necessarily have a diagnosable disorder. You might go to a counseling psychologist and say, you know what, I'm having a lot of stress at home. I'm having trouble with my spouse or my children, or I'm having problems with money, managing money. I'm having problems at work. Well, there's no real diagnosis for that. It's a problem of adjustment. It's a problem with dealing with some real-life, day-to-day issue. So a counseling psychologist is going to be less likely to work with someone with, let's say, severe autism or schizophrenia, and more likely to work with people who have everyday problems that could still benefit from therapy. So you'll find counseling psychologists everywhere. Often They have their own practice or they're part of a group practice, but you can find them in a lot of settings too. Anywhere you can think where someone might benefit from therapy, you are going to find a counseling psychologist. Often in high schools, college campuses, just to deal with the day-to-day problems that these populations might have. So the big difference between a clinical psychologist and a counseling psychologist is that clinicians work with people who have diagnosed psychological disorders. Counseling psychologists mostly work with people who have everyday, just day-to-day problems who could benefit from therapy. The next area that I'd like for you to know is educational and school psychology. This one's pretty much a no-brainer. These are people who are going to work in a school setting. These people would focus primarily on issues surrounding and related to education. And it might be as simple as motivation to learn. Dealing with students who really aren't motivated to come to school or motivated to do the work associated with school. But then more specifically, a school psychologist would be very well versed in different kinds of learning disabilities, divergent learning, that is children who have different kinds of learning styles, and other issues related to education. They may test for learning disabilities, test for other difficulties, do intelligence testing, anything that you would think would be associated with a school setting. That's going to be a school psychologist. And then of course some guidance and career counseling when the time comes for those students. The last area of applied psychology that I'd like for you to know is called industrial and organizational psychology, often referred to as IO psychology. These psychologists work primarily in a business or organizational setting. Their goal is to optimize teamwork, optimize human resources, optimize employee motivation, supervisor-employee relationships, improving employee attitudes and morale when the time comes. So the goal is for these psychologists is to produce a productive and happy work environment. So if you have sort of a business field inclination, this might be an area for you, because IO psychology bridges together what we know from psychology research and then puts it into an applied or business setting. One of the things that I want you to know is that as I've listed these areas of applied psychology here, notice I haven't said psychiatry or psychiatrist. People often confuse psychology with psychiatry. The important difference is that psychologists go to graduate school. They will earn either a master's degree, a PhD, or something called a PsyD, P-S-Y-D. So these are graduate level degrees in psychology obtained through a graduate program. Psychiatrists are medical doctors. They are physicians, so they have gone through medical school. For the most part, with few exceptions, only psychiatrists can prescribe medication. Psychologists cannot. Now, like I said, there are a few exceptions. A few states will allow a psychologist to prescribe medication with the appropriate training. But in most cases, only a psychiatrist can prescribe medicine. Psychiatrists are also trained in the study of behavior and mental processes, but of course the slant is a little bit different because they're taking a medical perspective on it. So they may be less inclined to understand the subtle nuances of someone with panic disorder, let's say, because they're trained more in larger medical issues, maybe something like schizophrenia or an eating disorder. So the goal for both psychologists and psychiatrists is the same, and that is to improve the mental health of others. But the type of training that they receive and the perspective on which they base their therapy differs just a little bit. A psychiatrist is going to see you as a physician sees a patient. It is a doctor-patient relationship. A psychologist is likely to see you as a client, where you have a shared responsibility in therapy and you are equals. You are equals in the process. And that's just a slightly different perspective on how we treat people with psychological issues. If you take a look at the next slide, I want to briefly talk about how modern psychology came to be. That is just the three major forces or trends in psychology that we've seen over its 100+ year history. Through the history of psychology from that wonderful time in 1879, we have seen three major forces or three major trends in psychology. And what I mean by that is how we framed the perspective of psychology. In other words, what psychology should be and what it is that we should be studying in psychology. The first recognized force is called psychoanalysis. And psychoanalysis is the force in psychology that was first developed by a very famous person in psychology named Sigmund Freud. If you've taken any kind of psychology course before, or probably just in popular culture, you have heard about Freud. Freud is a very unique individual in the history of psychology and had some very, very interesting ideas. But his brand of psychology was really recognized as the first one because it was the first one that really caught on. So Freud's brand of psychology, called psychoanalysis, really came into being in the late 1800s and early 1900s. Now you have to put this in perspective. This was the Victorian era. People were very prim and proper. There were certain things that were never discussed or never brought up because good people of high social standing would never talk about things like potty training and sex and those kinds of taboo subjects. We would sit in the parlor and drink tea and talk about very light things or politics or something like that. So for Freud to come out with the ideas that he had, and like I said, some of them are pretty left field, and to come out with them during this period was very interesting because some people just thought that his ideas were too shocking. Freud's approach to psychology is that psychology should be the study primarily of our unconscious wishes and desires. He believed that because people lived in this Victorian era where certain things were just taboo and not spoken of, it resulted in a lot of conflict that we had to keep suppressing, that we had to keep pushing down into the unconscious mind because it just wasn't acceptable to talk or think about certain topics. So as a result, a lot of conflict and tension builds up in our unconscious mind, and that can lead to psychological problems such as anxiety. So he believed that it was primarily our unconscious wishes and desires that drove behavior. So the goal of psychology should be to try to bring out and understand these unconscious wishes and desires. Unfortunately, if they're unconscious, we can't directly observe them. So he had to use techniques such as dream analysis and hypnosis, although he actually later in his own life didn't use hypnosis as much because he wasn't really pleased with the results, and people sometimes acted in strange ways under hypnosis. But he believed that there were ways to kind of unlock the unconscious mind so we could better understand what was going on within a person's mind. So this dominated for 20, 30 years or so. But then there was a change in psychology. Some psychologists were kind of tired of trying to study something that could not be objectively measured. I cannot measure your unconscious wishes and desires, and I certainly can't observe them. So what we see is a movement from the force of psychoanalysis to the second force, which is known as behaviorism. Psychology moved from the study of primarily unconscious wishes and desires to the study of observable behavior. In other words, behaviorists were not at all interested in studying the mind. That's not to say they didn't believe it existed or didn't believe that it could influence behavior. They simply said, we are not equipped to study the mind. All we can study is what we can observe right in front of us. So what they did was decide to change the study to the study of observable behavior. And then more specifically, how can we predict, control, and manipulate behavior through the environment? So that is, if I see a behavior that you're engaging in and I don't want you to engage in that behavior anymore, I can pair it with something that you don't like, such as a bad score on your homework, or if you were a child, I could give you a timeout or a spank or something like that. So we can understand not only what your behavior is, but then we can better understand how behavior can be predicted and controlled. So that was the goal of behaviorism, to understand behavior through prediction and control of it. Behaviorism dominated psychology for about 30 years, so now we're getting into about the 1950s or so. And then we see the third force or trend in psychology emerge. Behaviorism was all well and good, except the problem during this time is that humans were treated essentially the same as rats and pigeons and rabbits. That is, I can punish a person to get them to stop doing something, just like I can punish a rat or a pigeon to stop doing something I don't want it to do. So in other words, although behaviorism had its merits, we kind of lost the humanity in psychology, because we were essentially equivalent to all lower animals if we're just talking about studying observable behavior. So the third force, which is called humanism, kind of brought back around focus on human traits, human abilities. So the third force, which is called humanism, was sort of a backlash to behaviorism. It brought back around the idea that psychology should be the study of mental processes, so again, delving back into that mind, but that it really should focus on human traits and human abilities. For instance, our ability to be ethical, our ability to have empathy, our ability to have free will and make decisions, even if those decisions aren't necessarily good ones. Those are all part of what it means to be human. Humanism also had a focus on the inherent good in people. A humanistic psychologist believes that people are inherently good and they are motivated to be the best people that they can be. In other words, we all have a motivation, a drive to use the talents that we have to be the best person that we can be. And that is a uniquely human perspective. So humanists would emphasize the free will and the inherent good in people while focusing mostly on human traits and focusing on human behavior and human mental processes. That of course brings back the study of the mind, because all behavior starts with what goes on up in the mind. More recently in psychology, if you take a look at the next slide, there's just a couple areas that I want to mention because they've been coming up a lot and they will continue to come up quite a bit. One more recent trend in history isn't a new area of psychology because I've already mentioned it, but how it is used has exploded in the last 30 to 40 years, and that is cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychology, again, is studying higher cognitive abilities, such as reasoning and logic and memory and language. But it was harder to study that and get a better understanding of it because we didn't have a very good model of it. In other words, if I want to build a model as to the factors that might lead you to buy a certain car, or factors that might lead you to ask out a certain person, we didn't really have any good ways to build that kind of model. But the invention of the computer allowed us to begin doing that. So with the increased capability of computers came the increased ability of cognitive psychologists to model and predict our behavior in ways that we never thought possible. So for instance, there might be software running on your computer that records different websites that you go to, that tracks the products that you're looking at on the internet, and that's building a model. Okay, this person is this age, this gender, makes this much money, lives in this geographical area. What is he or she doing? What is he or she buying, thinking about, looking at, interested in? And all of this can be stored and then modeled using a computer, and we could never do that before. Same thing with the grocery store. There are ways to track what it is that people buy so we can look at trends. What leads someone to make a certain decision about this purchase versus this purchase? All of that is possible to be modeled on the computer, where before it wasn't. So cognitive psychology has seen a recent boom because of our ability to model behavior, and then in the end, the application of that, of course, for businesses is higher profit. Another recent trend in psychology is the area of neuroscience. Now, neuroscience isn't just restricted to psychology. Neuroscience is shared with many other sciences. But in neuroscience, we focus primarily on the biological treatment for psychological disorders. So that is, I might be able to inject cells into the area of the brain that we know is damaged in Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's disease. If we can inject what we call stem cells, immature cells that can eventually become what we need them to be, then maybe we can replace what is lost or replace what is damaged. So that's just one way in which neuroscience puts a new spin on how we treat psychological disorders, where before we were simply limited to medication and other forms of therapy. Also in neuroscience, we are better able to study mental processes using a wonderful machine called the MRI. MRIs have allowed us amazing access into real-time brain functioning. That is, I can give someone a task, and then using MRI, I can look at the areas of the brain that are active during that task. So we have a better understanding of the relationship between brain function and behavior. Another interesting application of that is being able to determine when someone is lying. And that's something I'll talk more about in another lecture. But recent evidence suggests that there are certain areas of the brain that are active when we are lying or deceiving than when we are telling the truth. And that makes sense, because when you're lying, you're not actually accessing your memory. You are making up a story. You are making up or fabricating information. So that would not necessarily show activation of the same areas that memory would show if you're actually trying to retrieve a memory. So some of the applications are very interesting. We might be treading on some ethical grounds here, but that is beyond the scope of this lecture. And the last recent trend that I want you to know that has come about, particularly in the media, is the area of forensic psychology. Forensic psychology is essentially the union of psychology and the law, or psychology within the legal system. And of course there are many applications of that. The two that I want you to know about is probably what forensic psychologists do best, which is assessing someone's competence. So using his or her psychological training, his or her job is to sit down with someone accused of a crime and determine whether or not the person is competent to stand trial and whether or not the person understands what he or she has done and the potential consequences of those actions. Because that psychologist's determination will have a large impact on the sentence that is handed down for this person. So assessing competence is a large part of what forensic psychologists do. The other part is profiling, and what I really mean is profiling potential criminals. Trying to understand the mental processes and personality traits of a potential criminal to predict his or her next move. So in profiling, you are literally building a profile of a person using available evidence to predict his or her next move so you can apprehend this person. So there are lots of examples in TV and in the movies of profilers, but this is what they do. They use their psychological skills to build this predictive model of how this person might act and what he or she might do next. If you take a look at the next slide, I just want to show you a little bit about where psychologists live. Where are they? Well, as you can imagine, most of them, because they are therapists, either clinical or counseling psychologists, are in private practice. So slightly over a third of psychologists are in private practice. So they would be in a group therapy setting where there's multiple therapists within one office, or they might have their own individual office somewhere that could be affiliated with a hospital, a university, a clinic, but maybe not. It might just be a standalone office. Another very common location for psychology professionals is in colleges and universities. Now, they can be either functioning as counselors or clinicians for the student population, or they can be educators. So they can be psychology professors and researchers who may have their own lab and who may be training future generations of psychologists. Next, hospitals and clinics. Again, this is really where you're going to see clinical psychologists. Almost 20% of psychologists work in hospitals and clinics, so you know that clinical psychology is a huge subdiscipline within the field. So remember again, people who work in hospitals and clinics are going to be working with primarily people with psychological disorders. And then a smaller percentage of psychologists work in business and government, work in the schools, and then we just have the nebulous category of other. So by and large, you're going to find psychologists in private practice, in colleges and universities, or in hospitals and clinics. This concludes the lecture on what is psychology.